Okay, so we're into the ocean now, and we're starting to talk about the diversity and the variety of different biomes that exist within the ocean. And what we can do is start with the biome that is going to be closest to shore. So let's take a look at the mangroves here. So mangroves are coastal areas. These are one of the few plants salt water. Okay. One of the few plants that are adapted to salt water. So mangroves are actually really, really cool plants, trees, that have different adaptations to actually get rid of salt. So right on the edge of the ocean, the coastal areas, whether it's a beach, it's a estuary, it's a little island, the mangroves that actually have their root systems into the water are going to be called red mangroves. So what we're looking at here, these two pictures are all of the what are called prop roots. Those roots anchor the mangrove into the sand and lock in. And then those roots become an ecosystem. Look at all the little fish. Vast majority of fish that go out to your coral reef will actually begin their life in the mangroves. They start there as juveniles, they grow up, they mature, and then they move out to the reef where they can now fend for themselves. Mangroves will actually reclaim land from the ocean. Those roots hold soil, they hold the sand. So as the ocean wave comes in, it traps the sand and the sediment and accumulates it there and builds this up over time. So they can actually rebuild shorelines. The problem? Mangrove biomes are one of the most highly threatened biomes on the planet. Who wants ugly, dirty, stinky trees here? Let's cut it down and have a nice white sandy beach. Beach is pretty until hurricane comes through and rips out your entire beach because you have nothing to block the force of the wind, the waves, and the storm action. So these places are incredibly important for protecting the shorelines. Again, let me get that in here. Reclaimed land from the ocean. They stabilize shorelines, and they are significant nurseries for fish, shrimp. We'll just put marine species. Okay, lots and lots of species go into the mangroves for survival. Okay, so if we're at the mangroves and then we push our way out, if it's shallow enough water, we're going to go through turtle grass beds. Now, turtle grass beds are shallow. They might be 6 inches, might be 6 feet, but these are found in the shallow water where sunlight can easily reach the bottom of the water column here. Let's get that up there. All right. The bottoms tend to be very sandy. So the turtle grass has adaptations to lock its root system into that sand, and then it sends out all these little runners or things we call rhizomes. If you guys are familiar with plant growth, rhizomes are these underground stems that go underneath the sand, and then they pop up new blades of grass everywhere they can. So very, very important. Stabilizing the sand, providing a grass type of biome here. Lots of grazers here. Turtles. Different sea turtles love going into turtle grass beds. Bigger things like manatees. Those things just cruise through the turtle grass, munching on it like a cow in a pasture. And then this ball thing over here. This guy over here is known as an urchin. They're a type of animal that eats turtle grass. They're a grazer. Then they provide food for the next level of the food chain and so on and so forth. So a very, very interesting biome. If you have the patience and the ability, grab a little turtle grass blade, put it under a microscope, and you're going to find hundreds of little animals living on there. These tiny microscopic little animals will be attached to that blade of grass, little hydroids and all sorts of crazy things on a blade of grass. So a lot of diversity, but generally an overlooked ecosystem that often is not viewed as being very significant or important to most people. But again, a big part of coastal ecosystems, because what turtle grass will do is it will help filter runoff coming from land as it enters into the ocean. If it flows through the turtle grass, it can filter out pollutants before that water reaches further out and hits the coral reef. They're kind of like a buffer strip. And we'll talk about buffer strips when we get into conservation, restoration, terrestrial ecosystems that border freshwater aquatic systems. You want buffer strips. Think about the turtle grass like a buffer strip. So, all right, now let's get out to the most diverse part in the ocean. Those are coral reefs. Coral reefs house the greatest biological diversity in the ocean. They are the ocean's parallel or equivalent to the tropical rainforest. They have all these coral polyps that live symbiotically with algae. So the algae is inside the tissue of the coral, photosynthesizing, giving the coral food. The coral then grows and creates the coral reef. So they work together. When the algae leaves, coral bleaches, and then the coral dies. That's a huge problem. We'll discuss this in a later unit of the semester, talk about stresses and things like that. Runoff from land, ocean temperatures changing, pH, etc. There's a whole list of problems hitting the poor coral reefs, and we want to figure out what can be done to try to minimize it. So, all right, so things to note about the coral reef. They are found in shallow water. Now, shallow is a relative term. It might be 60, 80, or 100 feet deep, but they need water that is shallow enough for the light to reach down to the coral because they have to photosynthesize. So they tend to be in water that is nutrient poor. This allows sunlight to penetrate deeper, and the water tends to be warm tropical waters. Okay, so let me give you guys a little drawing here to kind of hopefully explain it better. So here's your shoreline, and there's the bottom of your water, bottom of your ocean here, your benthic zone. And if you have a whole bunch of algae here photosynthesizing in the water column, let's assume here's the surface of the water. You get a whole bunch of algae here. It's not going to be nearly as easy for sunlight to get down through that to hit the bottom where your corals are going to be growing and surviving. This area, a whole lot easier for sunlight to reach. So this is why we say nutrient poor. This is nutrient rich. All that green stuff, all that algae is there because there's a lot of nutrients. This area over here, number 2, doesn't have the nutrients, doesn't have the algae, so there's not as much blocking the sunlight. So number 2 is going to have a lot more opportunity for coral growth, provided it's shallow enough for the sunlight to reach the bottom. If it's too deep and the sunlight just can't get all the way down there, obviously you don't have corals. So this is why shallow, nutrient poor, warm water is where we find the majority of coral reefs across this planet. Now, when we get these big algae blooms, because there's a lot of nutrients going into the ocean, it blocks out the sunlight and basically chokes out the coral because you can't get sunlight down to the coral for photosynthesis. And then the algae leaves, the corals bleach, and the reefs begin to die. So reefs are under unbelievable stress globally because of how we are changing the ocean. So we'll talk more again later about how we can do things to correct this and to adjust and to hopefully minimize the damage we're doing. So, all right, now let's actually push back to shore, swim back to shore here, and we're going to swim upstream. We're going to go to the shore and then find a river and start to go up that river. At that point, we will be in what we call the estuary. So an estuary is a region where fresh and salt water mix. So you have fresh water coming from land mixing or dumping into the ocean, changing the salt concentration, diluting the salt water, increasing the salinity of the fresh water, mixing it up, creating this estuary region. So there is a huge amount of stress in estuaries. Stress in regards to temperature, salinity, nutrients, I'll just say etc. That it's constantly fluctuating. We get a big rainy spring in the Midwest, all that water is running down to the Gulf of Mexico eventually. It takes days to weeks to get there, but that's going to hit the Gulf of Mexico and impact that area, even though the rain was thousands of miles away. It's because of how all these systems are connected through the hydrological cycle. But estuaries are highly stressed environments. Salt's constantly changing, temperatures changing, all those things are changing. But these are also known as the marine nurseries. Lots of biodiversity here, lots of productivity in the estuary. Terrestrial species come to the estuaries to reproduce, so do marine species. So it's this convergence of aquatic and terrestrial coming together to have their babies. And there's a massive amount of life being born to estuaries. Again, the challenge is they're stressed. Some of that stress is natural and the species are adapted, but a lot of that stress is human-induced stress, things we're doing to them. So we push away from the estuaries and we can get into these areas known as salt marshes. Now, these are a little different than an estuary. A salt marsh is a coastal wetland that is flooded on a regular basis. High tides, storms bring in the salt water, things like that. They're close to the shore and they're constantly getting deluged with salt water. There's a lot of productivity here as well. That's a big thing. Productivity is fantastic. And again, you get this mixture of terrestrial and aquatic species in this particular biome here. Now, if we are running along the side of the shore, we may come across these tide pools. Tide pools are these depressions in the rocky shoreline. So you'll find this in different parts of the world along the coastal areas where high tide comes in and it floods the shore area and these little pockets of water form and then the pocket of water slowly evaporates. Harsh conditions. So imagine that little pool of water there and it's 95 degrees out, bright sun for the next 5 hours. It's going to get hot in that water. So anything living in that tide pool has to deal with significant fluctuations in temperature, pH, salt levels. As that water evaporates, your salinity increases significantly. You get a heavy rain, all of a sudden you're full of fresh water. So really, really difficult conditions. But there's life adapted to the tide pools. There's actually some really cool creatures in the tide pools. Anybody remembers or is familiar with a mollusk known as a chitin? Those guys live in these tide pools. All sorts of little snails will live in there eating the algae and the producer base in the tide pools. Okay, in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at barrier islands and then we'll progress our way into the freshwater ecosystems and biomes.